Welcome to a question and answer episode of the Old Frontline podcast. In these bonus episodes, we'll answer the questions that you pose out of the episodes that we release each week. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast via your favourite platform, and do think about leaving us a review or a star rating. So let's get down to this week's questions. Welcome to another question and answer episode, bonus episode of the Old Frontline podcast. And it's a busy time for me as a battlefield guide and military historian, with the 80th anniversary of D-Day and a whole host of battlefield tours in June and July. So for a couple of months, the podcast is going to go to bi-weekly episodes with these bonus episodes, and I'm hoping the odd dispatches thrown in there too. So plenty of content to keep you going, and let's get down to this week's questions. I'm really pleased to see the questions continue to come in on a regular basis. A day doesn't go by when emails and messages on the Discord server don't come in with really fascinating questions. Continue certainly to fascinate me, and I hope that some of these questions fascinate a wider audience too. And we've got some good ones in this episode. So let's get down to that. Our first question is from Simon on email. With all the miles of walking you must have completed over the old front line, you must have found many things that belong to soldiers along the way. It'd be interesting to know which is your best find and why, and if you found out anything about the soldier it belonged to. Now that is an interesting question, Simon. And walking those battlefields, kind of almost absorbing that landscape, you get connected to it in all kinds of way with what you see on that landscape, with the cemeteries and the memorials and the traces, the ghostly traces of trenches in the fields. But when you walk it throughout the course of a calendar year, and when I lived there, I saw it in every type of weather, from rain to baking hot sunshine to snow. You could see how that landscape changed. And with the ploughing, with the change in the landscape, the detritus of war would somehow emerge from that landscape, the objects that connected you to the Great War. And of course, in great profusion would be bullets and shrapnel balls and sections of metal from shells. Shrapnel, most people would call it, but shell shard was its technical name at the time. And that detritus of war is everywhere. You can't but not see it. Farmers' tractors pick it up when they plough the fields, and when they go onto the tracks they rub up against stones and rocks, and things fall off the tyres in the mud, and you can walk the furrows of those tracks and find all kinds of things. And there are common items that are disassociated with an individual. Bits of ordnance, you might find weaponry, bayonets and rifles, fragments of water bottles and entrenching tools and helmets. But amongst it all are personal items that link you to an individual soldier. Even if he's unknown, it's the kind of thing that he'd have in his kit. So I've found cutlery that soldiers carried with them that they ate their grub with, particularly spoons with big bowls so they could get those tins of plum and apple jam open and get that jam down their neck as quickly as possible. And I've got to say that I never go looking for these things. They seem to find you, and I've certainly never used a metal detector. It's totally forbidden on these battlefields anyway, and that would not be the right approach in my mind. But when you walk with the permission of landowners across fields, I've done that to trace the lines of trenches and things like that, you can't help but see these items from that conflict. They are kind of everywhere at certain times of year. But certain little things, particularly if I think about it now, kind of spring out. So not long after I first moved to Courcelette, we walked up the sunken lane at the back of the house there, up towards Regina Trench. And the house that I lived in then had a cellar, an original cellar, with the remains of a tunnel that came out from it into that sunken lane. That had all been sealed up. But we knew that that was there, and the banks of that sunken lane had been used for funk holes, for shelters, for troops. And that particular year, they kind of sliced a chunk of it out, and quite a few things fell out of it. And one of the things that fell out was a pewter lid of a soap dish. And initially, it wasn't clear what it was. So clean the mud away, and there in beautifully engraved writing was in English, soap. So this was the lid of a soap dish, and when I took the mud away, knocked the bottom of it off, turned it over, there was a big solidified chunk of soap, very perfumed soap, in that lid still. And just licking my finger and running it over the soap, the smell, that perfume smell of the soap, just came straight out of it. And that was an immediate link to the past. I'll never know who that soldier was who carried that in his pocket. Was it an officer? Was it a Canadian? Courcelette was a Canadian battlefield, but British units served there during the winter of 1916-17 and again in 1918. So who knows who carried that? But it was an intensely personal item. And when you consider how soldiers got so dirty in the trenches, having soap like that must have been a real kind of luxury, really. So that item is a very, very poignant one, I think. And walking in the winter a few times when the ground was particularly good for finding things, the way kind of frost seemed to move ground around and it would thaw, and then ploughs would turn fields and you'd see things scattered. Over those years, I found a couple of identity discs, one of a Canadian soldier who was killed at Courcelette in October 1916. His name was on the Vimy Memorial. He has no known grave. And I immediately went back with the permission of the landowner, and we had a cursory kind of search where I'd found this disc just to see if there was any human remains. The discovery of a disc like that can often lead to the discovery of the body of a soldier. But no, there was nothing. I mean, some men were sadly almost obliterated by those terrible bombardments, and maybe the disc was the only thing that survived following that, or the disc was picked up from a body by a comrade, meant to take it back, and he dropped it in that area en route back to the front line or back to a reserve position, and it was lost until I found it all those years later. So that disconnects me to an individual, a young man from Canada who volunteered to enlist in 1915 and came across to fight and then was killed in that toughest of battles at Courcelette in October 1916, when the battlefield had gone wet and muddy and was smashed to bits by shell fire, and he remains part of that landscape, part of that battlefield to this day. But I think when you walk those battlefields, seeing those artefacts, I think that kind of tactile history is so important. The archaeology, the preservation of the archaeology is really important. The surface finds can lead us to much more important archaeology, and many archaeologists probably wouldn't want people to pick a lot of stuff off the surface, but I think all of those who visit cannot resist that compulsion. And it is those private items, which we don't ever own. One day I hope that all those things will go to a museum. But I think those items really do renew our interest, connect us in a way that nothing else can, and are all part of how that landscape really runs through everything that we do, and all the ways that we react to the history and the pathways and the stories, really, of the Great War. And I'll certainly be interested to hear what some of you have found in your journeys across those battlefields over the years. So, moving on to question 2, Ollie on email says, "The only time I ever hear about the Hampshire Regiment's involvement in the Great War is during the Gallipoli campaign and their landings at the Dardanelles in 1915. Were there any big involvements from the Hampshires on the Western Front, and if so, what were they?" Well, I think if you look at the history of the British Army and the huge number of regiments that existed at that time, I do mention some regiments as we have these discussions about the history of the battlefields of the Great War, and some I know that I mention more than others, like the Royal Sussex Regiment, because my background growing up in Sussex and my connection to it through veterans and stories I've researched is very much part of my own journey through that landscape of the First World War. And I try to kind of tell the stories of different regiments because there are so many of them. It would be impossible to mention them all without it becoming a kind of a list, really. But to answer your essential question about the Hampshires, yes, they're very famous for the landings at Gallipoli. when the Hampshire Regiment came in on the River Clyde, and I've mentioned that in a recent podcast episode at V Beach at Gallipoli, at Cape Helles on the 25th of April 1915, and then they fought right throughout the Gallipoli campaign. Meanwhile, the other regular battalion of the Hampshires was on the Western Front, and they were at the Battle of Le Cateau, the retreat from Mons, and the fighting on the Marne and the Aisne, and in the first Battle of Ypres in October and November of 1914. And eventually that battalion that had been at Gallipoli came to France, and on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, for example, both those battalions were very close, one near to Beaumont-Hamel, one on the Redan Ridge, fighting not quite side by side, but certainly in the same proximity. But the Hampshire Regiment, like so many county regiments, formed so many different battalions during the Great War, and you don't have to go far in the history of that conflict, whether on the Western Front or at Salonika or other theatres of war, to find mention of almost any regiment of the British Army in the Hampshires amongst it. And that same battalion of the Hampshires that you mentioned that was at Gallipoli had a very long war, fascinating war in some respects, in 3 theatres of operation: Gallipoli, Egypt, and then on the Western Front. And on the Western Front, it saw the terrible slaughter of the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and a few weeks later moved up to Ypres, up to Flanders, to the Ypres salient to have a rest. And it was holding the line near the village of Poteza in August 1916 when it came under a gas attack from a new type of German phosgene gas that caused very heavy casualties. So if you want to go to a bit of the Western Front, a bit of the Old Front Line, to see the Hampshires mentioned literally on that landscape in those beacons to the war, the silent cities, you can go to Poteza and find the dead of the Hampshire Regiment from that gas attack and following them back through the medical facilities as soldiers died of their wounds, right back to Lissenherk and indeed beyond. So that was a kind of not a major battle, but just holding the line when the battalion was gassed and they suffered heavy losses. And I mentioned when I answered a question recently about what is my favourite units that I kind of followed around, which is Loud as Lambs, how important the study of a particular regiment is in our wider understanding. And it is quite good to focus on a regiment and access their archives and look them up in the newspapers and the war diaries and so many other sources that we've got at our hands to follow their war, see how diverse their war was, uncover some of the stories. And the Hampshire Regiment Museum down in Winchester is a particularly good one. And although I never travelled to the Old Front Line with a veteran of the Hampshire Regiment, I took a party of men from the Regimental Association in the late 90s to Factory Corner near Flers on the Somme, where they scattered the ashes of George Louth, who was the last Great War veteran of the regiment. And I made a note of his name at the time and then lost it. And when I went to Winchester a couple of summers ago, I went into the Hampshire Regiment Museum. It's got an excellent First World War section, and there was a picture of George Louth and the story of him being the last veteran of that regiment from the Great War. So this kind of micro history of a particular unit is really important to kind of connect to our own parts of the country that we come from that have these regiments, and pretty much everywhere in Britain had them, some in great profusion. If you look at some of the northern regiments, they have massive regiments with huge numbers of battalions. But it also helps us understand the wider war too. And if you're looking for a little project to do, look at your local regiment, look at your local Royal Engineer or artillery unit, whatever it is. Go out there and you will find some fascinating Great War history. And as always on the podcast, we'll do as much as we can to try and highlight the stories of some of these regiments. So, moving on to question 3, and this comes from Matt on email. He says, as interest in the Great War seems to be both sustained and indeed growing since the centenary, I wonder what the current situation is in Germany. Do you feel that more people are interested now than in recent years? And has the recent film version of All Quiet on the Western Front made a difference? On my first and so far only trip to the Western Front last November, we visited the German cemetery at Neuville-Saint-Vaast, and it certainly left an impression on me. Well, that is a really interesting question, Matt, and a great one, because the Great War is not just about one side of no man's land. It's not just about the Belgians or the British and Commonwealth forces or the French. For 450 miles of the Western Front alone, there was a German army on that other side of no man's land, in the German position stretching from the Flanders coast right down to the Swiss border. And to understand any of those battles, any of those parts of the line, you have to see it as well from a German perspective. But we can't get away from the fact that Germany lost the war, and the outcome of that war threw Germany into a depression, an economic depression, and led to a polarisation of the nation and the rise of extreme politics of left and right, and a pathway to another great conflict, a story for another day. But across Germany, war memorials were built. If you go to Germany, you will find war memorials in almost every town and village, some of them incredibly ornate, often with the symbol of the Stahlhelm, the steel helmet on them, and some with huge amounts of detail. I can think of quite a few where I've been, which list men in date order, give their regiments, their place and their date of death, and you can get a lot of understanding how the war affected one particular community through that. If you go down into Bavaria, they published quite widely down there Sterbebilder, which are memorial cards with photographs of soldiers and a little bit of religious text on, and some of the churches have those in frames. When you go through parts of Bavaria and go into a typical Catholic church in that area, you'll find often these photographs of local men killed. So there's quite a lot really to kind of find there. But that's us going to see these things. What are the Germans doing? I think for a long, long while, pretty much nothing. And if you look at the post-Second World War history of Germany, with Germany divided with West and East under Russian, under Soviet occupation, and a different kind of history taught in the schools for generations of Germans until the wall came down in 1989, even since then, with the unification of Germany, I think interest in the Great War has not really been on their radar. I mean, I've met plenty of German visitors on the battlefields over the years. I got to know Klaus, my old friend who lived near Stuttgart, whose grandfathers were on the Somme, one killed near Serre in early 1916. He was passionate, obsessed with the Great War. And my friend Alex, who was fascinated in the history of the German army and the Great War, and we trudged those battlefields, particularly at Verdun, together quite a few times, and many other German friends and acquaintances that I've met by visiting that ground. But those people were very much in the minority, and I think all of them, if they were here with me now, would say that. But there is a kind of a change, perhaps a growth of interest, perhaps All Quiet on the Western Front, as you suggest, really did begin to change things, make Germans begin to think about the First World War, a war forever overshadowed in Germany, of course, with the events of a Second World War. And what was interesting for me when I was in Germany quite a lot in the late 80s and early 90s was I was trying to find some First World War German veterans to interview and failed dismally. I met a lot of Second World War ones and got to speak to them. And the men of that other generation, who were still alive then, were kind of very much in the background, almost impossible to kind of find, really. And their defences, like the Hindenburg Line and so many others on the Western Front, were so strong that I was never able to get through those defences and find my way to them to discover a bit more. I did speak to some German veterans, but they were Germans, Jewish Germans who had moved to Britain in the interwar period to get away from Nazi Germany. So all of that in mind, I still think that there is a growth of interest, and there are quite a lot of German listeners to this podcast, and quite a few of my German pals who listen to this. Thank you. You send me a lot of really interesting emails to tell me what you're up to. And I'm glad we have an audience like that. The audience has got to reflect what the war was about. And the war, as I say, was not just about Belgium, Britain, the Commonwealth, and France. The Germans have to be a part of it, quite obviously. And we see so many traces of the German history of the Great War. And that is important in our wider understanding. We tend to look at a battlefield like the Somme from the British perspective, with Albert behind the lines and the front lines going from Gommecourt to Montauban. But from the German perspective, their rear echelon was Bapaume, and all the villages that we kind of associate with the later battles were the places where their troops were billeted, where their regimental memorials were built, and where their Soldatenfriedhof, their Heldenfeld, their heroes' fields were placed to bury their dead killed in the quiet period and in the early phase of the fighting of the Battle of the Somme. Little of them survives on the landscape for all kinds of understandable reasons, but it's important to tap into that. And I remember during the centenary, one of the BBC correspondents spoke to a group of students in Berlin at a sixth form college and showed them some photographs of the men in Gates, of Tyne-Cot, and Vancouver Corner in Flanders, and they were really interested in them. And then he showed them some pictures of Langemark, and they were really surprised that a German cemetery from the Great War even existed in a place like Belgium. And the comments were, we're fascinated by this. Where do these Germans sit in our collective history? What do they mean to us? And what can we learn from their experience of that part of the 20th century? And perhaps it will be this next generation emerging now that will really come to terms with Germany's history in that century and Germany's involvement in those battles of the Great War. I sincerely hope so. So our fourth and final question comes from the Discord server. And remember, there's two ways to send questions in. In fact, there's three now, actually. So one is by email, and the other is to post something on the Discord server. And there's links to both of those in the show notes for this episode, and indeed all episodes. And Buzzsprout, who host our podcast, have added a facility where you can send a text in. So you click on that, and you send an SMS, and it comes through the Buzzsprout website to me in my app, and I can read it there. So whichever method you choose, do send your questions in and do keep them coming. But Jan's posted this on the Discord server, and Jan says, with so many unknowns lying in graves that are marked known unto God, can you describe the process by which some are being identified? I find it fascinating that someone who was arrested for more than a century without identification is now given their name, and a rededication ceremony can take place with relatives in attendance. Are you aware of any books available on the subject, especially to those in Canada? Well, this is something that has kind of emerged in the last few years. The discovery of the dead of the Great War goes back to the war itself, and in that immediate post-war aftermath, then the search for bodies began. Not every soldier was found. So even a century later, with farming, with roadworks, with archaeology, the remains of soldiers from every nation that fought in the Great War are continued to be found on these battlefields. That's one level of it, but that's not what Jan is talking about here. What Jan refers to is a recent phenomena where researchers have researched particular graves and then given up enough evidence to prove that that grave is in fact this individual, not an unknown sergeant of the Canadians or an unknown major of the Royal Sussex Regiment or whatever it is. He's actually this person. So what's the process for that? Well, that's a very good question. I would guess it involves a lot of research. Now, I look at a few examples from my own experience of seeing headstones where you look at them and you think, hang on a minute, why is that grave unidentified? And I remember many years ago when I was doing the walks for my Walking Ypres book, Walking the Salient as it came out in its first edition, and I went up to 1st DCLI Cemetery up on the bluff near Ypres, and there was a headstone there of an unknown captain of the Queen Victoria Rifles. Now the QVRs, the Queen Victoria Rifles, were the 9th Battalion of the London Regiment, and I knew that they'd served at Ypres during the First World War. They'd been very active just up the road at Hill 60 during the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915, and they'd gone on to serve in some of the subsequent battles as well. So I went to the Men in Gate and Tyne-Cot. There was only one captain Fazakali Westby, and I did a bit of research, and given where the cemetery was, Fazakali Westby had been killed at Hill 60, so it seemed quite logical that his body might have been found and moved to that cemetery after the war. I contacted the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, this was back in the 90s, and they confirmed that the body had been moved from the Hill 60 area, but there wasn't enough evidence, or I'd not supplied enough evidence for them to be convinced it was him. So I wrote the story up in my book, Walking Ypres, and I don't really know what happened, but a couple of years went by and I went up there on a walk with some friends, walked into that cemetery. There was a brand new headstone which now said Captain Fazakali Westby, 9th London Regiment, killed there in April 1915. So he now has an identified grave. So either someone in the commission looked into it, or someone read the book and submitted a case themselves, or perhaps someone was researching him in the background that I didn't even know about and had already submitted a case, and that led to the changing of his headstone. So this is kind of what's going on. Researchers were looking at headstones, coming across headstones on the battlefields and doing research and submitting cases. The slight difference now is that the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, for each casualty, have added burial records as well as the other information onto the page for that casualty. So when you go and look a soldier up, if he's in a cemetery where he's been concentrated, been exhumed from site on the battlefield and moved into that cemetery after the war, it gives the concentration report on there and you can see details. And there's quite a lot of really interesting information on those, showing how the body was identified from artifacts, a watch or a cigarette case or a knife with a bone handle where a number and unit had been engraved on there, or a piece of webbing, and all kinds of things. But it lists that soldier that you're looking up, but also the men in the same row. So occasionally you see a row where there's a couple of identified soldiers and then some unknowns with some very tempting information that could lead to an identification. And when you look up those identified casualties, you can, on that burial report, then see the information about those unknowns. And I think this has also happened where people have looked at those records and thought there's enough evidence here to submit a case, and gone off and researched it in the archives, pulled out all the documents, proved that this soldier, having been found at this map reference, can only be this man. And as I understand it, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of these cases that have been submitted to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and they are gradually going through them and either approving them or rejecting them for reasons obviously unknown to me. But this has led to the identification of men that were buried in graves marked as unknowns, but new information has come to light to show that they are actually buried there. And then the headstone is changed. There's a new dedication for the headstone and a little ceremony. I think if family members can be found, they come out for it as well. So this is, for me, I think, another example of the continual turning of the pages of Great War history. It never stops. And there's no kind of great science involved in this. They will never exhume a soldier for DNA to prove it exactly. That's something the Commission won't do at all. If bodies are found on the battlefield for those reasons we discussed earlier, archaeology, farming, roadworks, whatever, then those remains are tested, DNA is taken, and can be used to help identify a soldier down the line. But if we're talking about soldiers that were buried in cemeteries a century or more ago, and you're using paper research to try and identify them, the Commission will not allow the exhumation of that grave to test the remains that are buried there. And I think that's an important element of this, and a right decision on the part of the Commission to not disturb these graves. And the onus then is on the reporter to gather the evidence to try and prove it from the archives. And there are some amazing researchers out there who have done this, and all plaudits to them for helping to bring the identity of a soldier out of the cold and having that headstone replaced, and now standing for all time named to the man who was buried there during the Great War. So like I say, this is the history of the Great War, the ongoing history of the Great War. It never ceases, it never ends, and it never fails to fascinate us, I think. And it's great to see that fascination taking on a different kind of level for some people, and they do good work like this. And I look forward to hearing about more dedications taking place on the battlefields over the coming months and years. So that's it for this bonus episode. Thanks for those great questions. I hope you found the answers of interest, and we'll see you again on the Old Front Line. You've been listening to an episode of the Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.